Welcome to another episode of The Cynical Writer. Today I will be discussing a topic that has bothered me for quite some time. You see, every time I go to a bookstore, it seems that all of the books seem like they could have been written by the exact same person. The writing is very simplistic, it is very uninspired, and I think that's a real problem. I think that there is this notion in modern literature that writing should only communicate the necessities, that writers in some sense should not be wordy. But I think that when writers write that way, they lose all sense of individuality. One of the great things about every writer is that every writer has their own set of vocabulary that they can use to every project. But I think one of the problems is that many editors try to commercialize books. They try to standardize them. So they take a lot of the writer's original vocabulary out. And I think that's a real problem. I think that we forget how rich language can be, how poetic language can be. In my opinion, the language of a book, how the language is used, that is just as important as the content itself. I mean, if you look back at many 19th century books, many of those books were written very beautifully. They had rich, beautiful language, and that is something that is missing in modern literature, and it's a shame. I think that Ernest Hemingway has actually been far too influential. Now, don't get me wrong, I love Hemingway, but that's just one style of writing. Not all authors should try to imitate Hemingway. There are many different authors out there. I mean, Shakespeare, who was probably the most greatest writer who ever lived, he wrote with such eloquence, with such dignity, with such character. And a lot of critics now will agree. They'll say, yes, Shakespeare is the greatest writer ever, but don't you dare try to write like him. Does that make any sense? Shouldn't writers try to write like the greatest writer who ever lived? I think so. I think it's just so silly that in modern literature, people expect writers to just write the basics, to just communicate as little as possible. I think that we need to have a new appreciation for the aesthetics of language. I think that language is an art. And I think it has to be mastered, but I think a lot of writers are very bad at doing that. So they try to condemn other writers who are good at that. I mean, I get criticized all the time for being wordy, but I actually think that a lot of those criticisms come from a place of jealousy or from ignorance. I think that there are a lot of readers out there as well that if they don't understand a piece of writing, or if they have to stop and think, then that's just too much for them. They want everything spoon-fed to them. And if they have to think, if they have to work hard, then that becomes a real problem for them. So I think that we need to come to appreciate language more than we have in the past. I mean, so many great writers. I mean, Edgar Allan Poe and Nathaniel Hawthorne and just so many others have used language in a very effective manner. And I think we're losing that now. And I don't think that the internet age has helped either. In the modern internet age, people are writing shorter sentences. Sometimes they're not even writing incomplete sentences. And that's a real problem. And I think that writers need to be able to adapt to different settings. So if you're writing, a short email, then yeah, you probably shouldn't be wordy. But if you're writing poetry or a story or a book, then you should explore with language. You should explore with your vocabulary. I think that if you always write the same way, then you're basically cheating yourself. And that's something that a lot of writers are doing nowadays. And it is a real tragedy, in my opinion. It's heartbreaking, actually, because so many writers, they have so much to give, and yet they are wasting their talent trying to please a group of critics and readers who are just ignorant. I mean, I'm really surprised at the number of writers and readers, for that matter, who just aren't familiar with the classics, or who think that the classics are old-fashioned or anything, or something like that. And I'm not trying to say, not by a long shot, that you should only read the classics. You should read all kinds of different books, all kinds of different types of literature. You should read magazines, online articles. I mean, anything that you can get your hands on, you should read. But I think that in some sense that the people who think that writers should only write simplistically, that they are in fact the snobs, because they only think that writers should write one way instead of being more diverse in the way that they write. So I actually think that this is the greatest problem within literature, that writers can't fully express themselves, that they must write in a very commercialized and standardized way. And I refuse to do that, because I need to write the way that I want to write, the way that I think works. But a lot of people, that if they can't write a certain way, then they don't want anyone else to write a different way. I mean, it's just heartbreaking to me that so many writers are just wasting their talents. And I think that at the end of the day, you have to harness your inner voice. You can't listen to the critics. You have to be honest with yourself. You have to give all of yourself to your craft, and that can be very draining, actually. I mean, I actually find writing to be somewhat intimidating, because it takes a lot of energy out of me. And that's why I actually don't write every day, and that's a topic that I will cover later on. Because I invest everything that I have into my craft. And some people might think that if you don't write every day, that means you're not truly dedicated. I just don't think that's the case. I mean, take a look at someone like Daniel Day-Lewis. I mean, he's not a writer, of course, he's an actor, but he only acts, every 4 or 5 years. Of course, he just retired, but up to that point, he acted every 4 or 5 years. And that he was very gifted as an actor, but doing that took a lot of energy out of him. So it took some time for him to recover, and it takes some time for me to recover as well. So I hope you enjoyed my speech today. Stay tuned for next week, where I will cover a different topic. Goodbye for now.